Hey, what's up seekers? Welcome back. Now that we have laid the groundwork with Maimonides' theology, cosmology, and epistemology, and seen their impact on his reading of key religious categories such as prophecy and providence, we're ready to move on to explore the most notorious chapter of the guide, insofar as our subject is concerned, the one which you've all been waiting for, Guide for the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 51. We're going to start with a walkthrough of this so-called mystical chapter of the guide, followed in the next episode by an analysis of the chapter's primary themes and language, some attempts to map it out, and its relationship to mysticism and Kabbalah. Let's go.
Seekers of Unity.
Chapter 351 has been referred to as the noblest chapter in the Noble Treatise, and was a favorite chapter amongst the Sufi-influenced Maimonideans who descended from the author himself. Hundreds of years later, Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, the Rav, referred to it as the most religious part of the guide, the chapter where the real Maimonides is revealed. And the philosopher who was the subject of the Rav's PhD dissertation, Hermann Cohen, the Jewish neo-Kantian rationalist philosopher, referred to these few final chapters of Maimonides' text as the magnificent climactic chapters of the guide, for which the rest of the book served only as a preparatory exposition preparing us for the climax to come. Yet others in the century following Maimonides, people like Shem Tov ibn Shem Tov, in his commentary on the guide, writes that there were many of the opinion that this chapter was either an interpolated forgery, which Maimonides' pen had never touched and his eyes had never seen, and which out of respect for Maimonides ought to be removed from the guide and burnt, or at the very least buried, so that no eye would ever see it again, even if Maimonides did in fact write it, which Ibn Shem Tov writes people were suspicious of. I want to walk you through this notorious, magnificent chapter, and hopefully, by the end we'll see why it got people so rightfully riled up. Despite this hyped-up introduction, Maimonides opens the chapter by informing the reader that they'll find nothing new in the chapter that hasn't been already proposed in the guide leading up to it, but rather that the chapter aims to function as a summary and conclusion to what has preceded it. But Maimonides also writes, despite downplaying it, that this chapter aims to explain the nature of proper worship as practiced by those who have apprehended the true reality of God, and aims to guide one towards this true worship, which is the highest end of mankind, and to show how God's providence watches over such a person who's reached this level of worship until they are brought over into eternal life. This is what Maimonides tells the reader that he hopes to cover in this chapter. No big deal. Maimonides, following this humbly ambitious introduction, presents us with a parable, his famous parable of the palace. The parable tells of different groups of people and ranks them in relation to their proximity to the king who resides inside the palace. Maimonides' own tier list of sorts from before it was cool. The first and furthest group are those who are living outside the kingdom or the city of the palace and don't really have much interest in the king at all. The second group are those inside the kingdom, or city, and have some interest in finding the king, but have no sense of direction, and actually, as a result, have their backs turned to the palace without even knowing it. The third group are those that really do want to get to the palace, and be in the presence of the king, and even have a basic sense of direction of how to get there, but they've never actually gotten even close enough to see even the outer walls of the palace. The fourth group are those who actually found the palace, but spend their entire lives circling its walls, never finding a way inside. The fifth group are those that make it inside but cannot find the king's inner chamber and spend their days tragically wandering the palace's hallways searching for the king's door. Then there are those, the sixth kind, who do find the door to the king's inner chamber, with its light shining from beneath the door, and even manage to enter the king's inner chamber to be in the same room as the king. But there's one more group, the seventh, who are able, after having entered the king's room, to make the further effort required to be able to actually stand in the king's presence, either from near or far, to hear and see or speak with the king alone. Maimonides then himself provides the interpretation of the parable, and it goes like this. The king in the parable represents God, no surprise there. The first group represent those who have no religious faith, neither via inherited tradition or from their own speculation, and they have no interest in finding God. Maimonides has some really old-school harsh things to say about this first group, and I'm not going to repeat his awfully dated words. They really didn't age well. You can look them up for yourself if you'd like. The second group, those inside the kingdom but with their back turned towards the palace, are those who do possess some sort of religious faith, belief, or philosophy, but one that happens to be incorrect and false. Maimonides says that this group is worse off than the first group, in fact, because this group is actually taking steps, they're making moves, but because they're facing the wrong direction with wrong beliefs, the further they go in their religion, belief, or philosophy, the further in fact they distance themselves from God. And again, I won't tell you how Maimonides believes that these people should be handled and treated. It's a pretty bad look. We have to cut him some slack because he is writing back in the 12th century, in the Middle Ages, but even then, sheesh. The third group, those who actually try to get to the palace but never end up seeing it, represent the religious masses, the many people who keep their religion and commandments but have no real conception of God. The fourth, those circling the palace trying to find a way in, are those who are devoted to the study and practice of the Torah, who hold true opinions, but not by their own merit. They were simply lucky that they were taught the truth, but never exercised their own minds in thinking about philosophy and religion to bring themselves to these correct propositions. Fifth are those who enter the palace but get lost inside its hallways. There are those who have entered, says Maimonides, the palaces of theology and philosophy, and have thought for themselves, but did not find God in the process. Then there are those, the sixth kind, who in their thinking and seeking find the chamber of the king. They find the proofs and demonstrations of all that may be proven and have ascended to the truth as much as humanly possible. Maimonides does something interesting here in his unpacking of the parable, in that, if you remember correctly, the parable contains 7 gradations of proximity to the king, and in the interpretation he provides, he ends after the 6th group, those who ascend to the truth of God with the power of their own reasoning and find themselves in the king's chamber. But he doesn't elaborate on the 7th group, the one who actually stands in the presence of God, the one who hears God's voice and sees the face of God. It seems, however, that Maimonides does in fact elaborate on the 7th group, and provides their correlate in the world of philosophy and religion, but not immediately here with the interpretation of the other 6. But he does so for the duration of the rest of the chapter, not only explaining what the 7th level is, but actually providing the tools to the individual about how they may in fact reach there and join perhaps the 7th group. We're going to see as we continue to unpack the chapter what the 7th group entails and what Maimonides believes it takes to be able to get there. Maimonides then begins his guidance and instruction, leading one to the king, addressed tenderly to a single student. Da beni, know my child, writes Maimonides, addressing his child, his student, to take up a rigorous study in mathematics, science, physics, and metaphysics, in accordance with what he writes in Guide 134, that there's no way to apprehend God except through the things which God has created, namely the world, through her sciences, physics, metaphysics, mathematics, and logic. And he lays out the various grades of perfection to which an individual may aspire, recapitulating the 4th, 5th, and 6th levels of the parable of the palace, this time describing the people of the 4th level as those who have mastered mathematics and logic, the 5th those who have mastered science and physics, and the 6th metaphysics. It is at this level that we began to transition to the 7th level, which Maimonides naturally equates with prophecy. Maimonides writes, there are those who, after having attained perfection in metaphysics, direct their mind entirely towards God, exclude from their thought any other thing. It is in this space, the degree of the prophets, in which one can begin to commune with God, speaking to and being spoken to by God. Maimonides then returns from the subject of prophecy and its varying degrees of proximity to the primary subject of the chapter, which is, quote, to encourage those who have attained a knowledge of God to concentrate all their thoughts on God alone. This full concentration upon God, writes Maimonides, is the worship peculiar to those who have acquired a knowledge of the highest truths, and the more they think of God, the more they are engaged in this worship, which again is only possible after one has cultivated correct beliefs about the nature of God, because otherwise they're not meditating upon God, but rather on the idolatrous figments of their own creation and imagination. Maimonides, building simultaneously on his Aristotelian epistemology, which we outlined in an earlier episode, and on a slew of biblical verses, advises the individual who has acquired, as much as humanly possible, an adequate conception of God, to devote themselves entirely to knowing and coming closer to God. Totally devote yourself to God, writes Maimonides. Endeavor to come closer to God and strengthen the bond between you and God, namely the intellect. Maimonides at this point differentiates between a true knowledge of God, which he equates with love of God, love and knowledge being commensurate in his thinking, and a worship of God, the former true knowledge and love being a precondition for the latter worship. And concludes the paragraph by writing, "It has thus been shown that it must be one's aim after having acquired knowledge of God to devote oneself entirely to God, and that one's heart and mind should be constantly filled with a longing for God." Maimonides advises the reader that this work should be done in seclusion and isolation, that a pious person should seek out such seclusion to meditate upon God, and only when absolutely necessary associate with and be in the company of others. This would have been great advice to practice during COVID. Maimonides then again describes the intellect which flows from God as that which connects us to God, as the bond which we may strengthen or weaken as we choose to, by exercising or neglecting it, strengthening it when we occupy our hearts and minds with God, making God the object and therefore subject of our intellection, and weakening it to the point of breaking when we give our minds over to anything else, to the false gods of every day and age, of which there are plenty. Maimonides then teaches that the sole aim of all religious activity, be it studying Torah, prayer, or the performance of the commandments, all have the sole goal of training one's mind to be filled with God alone, and to clear it of all worldly matters, to be, writes Maimonides, occupied with God and undisturbed by any other thing. Maimonides now launches into his practical advice on how the individual aspiring for God's presence and communion with the divine ought to meditate. Writing, "I will now commence to show you the way how to educate and train yourselves in order to attain this great perfection." Are you ready? This advice on how to train the mind to think exclusively about God is the very path which Maimonides teaches to take the individual from the 6th level, from the person who is simply in the presence of the king, to the 7th level, the person who is able to be in communication, to see the face and hear the voice of God. The state in which the mind is in uninterrupted contemplation of the divine, uniting with that which it contemplates, as the mind does. Maimonides instructs the individual to try concentrating on God exclusively, while reciting the Shema, a selection of verses from Deuteronomy that practicing Jews recite multiple times a day. Once one is able to concentrate exclusively upon God while reciting the first verse, one should move on and try hold their concentration for the entirety of the first paragraph, building gradually until they can recite all of the Shema while concentrating exclusively upon God. Maimonides writes, "When this has been carried out successfully and has been practiced consistently for many years, causing your soul, the whole of you, and your thought to be consistently directed whenever you read or listen to the Torah towards complete reflection on what you're listening to or reading. After some time, when you've mastered this, accustom yourself to have your mind free from all other thoughts, so that at all times, during all of your religious practices, your concentration is unbroken, be it while reading the prophets or while reciting your blessings, so that your attention is directed exclusively to the perception and understanding of that which you utter. When you have succeeded in properly performing these acts of divine service, and you have your thought during their performance entirely removed from worldly affairs, take care then that even while engaged in worldly affairs, your thought be not disturbed by thinking of your wants or superfluous things, but that your mind remains exclusively focused upon God." Maimonides here leads the individual on a Spartan training regimen of the mind to incrementally increase their capacity for unwavering concentration, from first just during the first verse of Shema, a total of 6 Hebrew words in length, to finally during the execution of all of one's religious duties, to not let the world and its concerns slip into one's mind at all, to remain focused exclusively on the commandments and the words one is engaged with in the moment and upon God, effectively making all of Judaism a playground and opportunity for mental training, for meditation and contemplation upon God. And some scholars have suggested, it seems like Maimonides is giving this advice from personal experience. Maimonides doesn't think that this is easy work, and expects it, as he writes, to take years of serious practice and training until one is properly capable of this degree of concentration. I challenge you to think of even one thing exclusively for 10 seconds and see how that goes for you. Maimonides adds next that while one is engaged in their worldly affairs, while one eats, drinks, bathes, talks with their spouse, children, or others, at those times one may think of their worldly affairs, but when one is alone at night, lying awake on their bed, be careful, writes Maimonides, to meditate in such precious moments on nothing but the intellectual worship of God, which consists of coming close to God being in God's presence in the way that I have described to you, writes Maimonides. Maimonides here guides the individual to actively find time in isolation and to contemplate exclusively in those moments upon God, in those free moments between one's busy daily chores. The next step for Maimonides is that even when one is engaged in worldly matters, while speaking with others or attending to your bodily needs, even then your mind should be at all times turned towards God, so that even while your body is in the society of men, surrounded by people in the day-to-day world, your heart remains always in God's presence. This level of presence, writes Maimonides, is what is described in the words of the Song of Songs, Ani yesheno v'libi er kol doidi doifek, I sleep, but my heart is awake, the voice of my beloved knocks. Maimonides reads the verse as hinting to a love between the human and God, in which the body goes through its worldly duties and obligations as if it were asleep on autopilot, sleepwalking almost, while one's heart and mind are elsewhere, awake, consumed with the awareness of God. This process of narrowing in on one's concentration, first just on the first verse of Shema, then during all of one's prayers, and then finally for all of one's religious duties, and then ultimately in all of one's waking moments of one's day, can be seen as the embodied or practical application which mirrors Maimonides' conceptual process of his negative theology, of narrowing down and removing all descriptions and positive attributes from God in one's mind, a cognitive theological process mirrored beautifully by Maimonides' embodied religious and meditative process. I would like to thank my friend Levi Morrow for pointing out this observation to me. Maimonides goes on next to enumerate a handful of biblical characters who he believes attain this level of intimacy with God. Maimonides writes, their mind was so identified with the knowledge of God, unified with God, that God made a lasting covenant with each of them. Maimonides sees a unique covenant emerging between these select individuals and God, resulting from their unbroken contemplation upon God. For even when they were occupied in worldly things, only their bodily limbs were at work, writes Maimonides, whilst their hearts and minds never moved away from God, even for a moment. For in those four, continues Maimonides, in reference to the patriarchs and Moses, union with God, namely apprehension and love of God, became manifest, and it became their life mission to bring this awareness to others. It was the chief aim of their whole life, writes Maimonides, to bring forth a community that should know and worship God. And again, the object of all their labors was to spread the unity of God in the world and to guide people to love God. Maimonides then writes that this degree of nearness to God, in which even one's worldly affairs are a form of worship and do not distract from God, isn't a level that's attainable for everyone, writing that even he himself, Maimonides, cannot aspire to such a level or to lead people to such a level. The Arabic is a bit ambiguous and could be translated either way. But he concludes the paragraph with a prayer, writing thusly, let us pray to God, that God remove the obstructions that separate us from God, even though most of these obstructions are our own creations. As the verse says, for but your iniquities have separated between you and your God. Read here by Maimonides, as many Jewish mystics after him, that it is only our iniquities which separate us from God. Were our sins to disappear, there would be nothing separating us from God. Like a dark cloud that obstructs the rays of the sun from reaching us, making the day dark, to borrow an analogy that Maimonides employs a little later, in reality the sun is always shining. Just take away the clouds that obscure the sun's rays and you'll see that it was a sunny day all along. God was never absent, it was only our sin which clouded the skies, blocking out the presence of God. In this reading, it is not God who hides from the human, but the human who affects God's hiddenness from themselves, and within whose power it is to reverse the course and have God revealed again in their lives. As Chacham Jose Fowler put it, Deus aspiconditus, the hidden God, is the human hiding from God, not God from the human. As Maimonides writes a little further on, it is clear that we ourselves are the cause of this hiding of the face of God, and that the curtain that separates us from God is of our own creation. This leads Maimonides into his theory of divine providence, which he describes as a most extraordinary idea which presented itself to him, which will dispel many doubts and solve many difficult metaphysical problems. We already covered Maimonides' magnificent take on providence, according to which the individual draws down upon themselves a degree of divine providence proportionate to the amount with which the individual connects themselves to the divine active intellect, effectuating in effect their own providence. If you'd like to learn more about that, check out the episode that we made on it here. Maimonides, the consistent thinker that he is, goes on next to apply the same logic to try to solve the problem of evil, more specifically the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people, why the righteous suffer while the evil prosper, by proposing that no evil can befall one who is in a state of mind which is united with God, writing, if one frees their thoughts from worldly matters and distractions, obtains a correct knowledge of God, and rejoices in that knowledge, it is impossible that any kind of evil should befall them, for they are with God, and God is with them. Namely, while in this meditative state, focusing one's heart and mind on God, after having obtained correct knowledge that what they're actually meditating on is God, and not some idol of their own making, the individual, writes Maimonides, in as clear terms as possible, is with God, and God is with them, and in that state, no evil may befall them. Maimonides quotes again a slew of biblical verses to back up this position. According to Maimonides' presentation, it is only when the righteous allow their minds to drift from God that they open themselves up to the possibility of evil befalling them. It's not entirely clear in this chapter here whether Maimonides intends with this that while in this perfect state of mind, nothing bad at all can happen to this perfected person, or rather that bad things may occur to them, but they will no longer be perceived as such because of their elevated state of mind. Next up, in a step that seems somewhat uncharacteristic for Maimonides the physician, who extols the health of the body and even sees it as a basic requirement of the spiritual path to prophecy, Maimonides here writes about how the vigor and virility of the body acts as a hindrance to the soaring of the mind, how the bodily strength of youth prevents and inhibits their moral and spiritual development. Quote, as the philosophers have already explained, hearkening back to the old Greek dichotomy between matter and form, body and mind, the struggle between the base human passions and the noble divine intellect given to the Son of Man trapped in the prison of flesh. Maimonides, taking this trope and running with it, writes, the human cannot attain pure thought, which leads to an intense love of God while their body is still hot. But the more the body is weakened and the fire of the passions quenched, in equal measure is the strength and brightness of the intellect increased. Its knowledge becomes purer and rejoices/finds bliss in what it apprehends. And here, on this somewhat anti-matter, body-negative note, the chapter comes to its final dying climax. 351's La Petite Mort, holding out hope for final perfection in the closing moments of life. Maimonides, writing presumably somewhere near his early 50s, a decade or so before he would leave his body behind and pass from this world, continues thusly. When a perfect person is stricken with years and approaches death, their knowledge and apprehension increases very powerfully, and the joy in their knowledge grows greatly, and the love for the object of their knowledge, namely God, grows even more intense until the point when in this great state of pleasure, their soul separates from the body. Maimonides says that this state and stage, this moment of rapturous pleasure and bliss, brought about by the unceasing contemplation of the perfect person upon a perfect conception and apprehension of a perfect God, is what is referred to by the sages of the Talmud when they speak of the deaths of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. To this state our sages referred when speaking of the deaths of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, that the three of them died by a kiss, interpreting the words from Deuteronomy 34:5, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab by the mouth of the Lord, that he died with a kiss of God, and the same for the siblings of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. The meaning of this strange expression of the sages, this kiss of death, writes Maimonides, is to indicate that the three of them died in the pleasure of their apprehension of God due to the intensity of their passionate love. This reading of the sages and their use of the imagery of a kiss to depict the intense, consuming love of God, which results in death, writes Maimonides, follows the biblical poetry of the Song of Songs, which writes, Yinashkeni minashikos pio, ki tovim doidecha miyayin. Kiss me with the kisses of your lips, for thy love is better than wine. And paying homage to Song of Songs, chapter 8, verse 6, Sim'eni kechesem alibecha, ki chesem al zerecha. Set me as a seal over your heart, as a seal upon your arm. Ki azza kamavas ava kasher kesh'el kino, for love is as strong as death, its jealousy as fierce as hell. Rishpeha Rishpe Ace shall have Asiyah, it sparks the fiery flames, the fiercest blaze of all. This state of love, which the sages read as the highest form of death, in which the soul which God blew into the nostrils of Adam is sucked back up by the mouth of God in the midst of a passionate kiss, no longer back to back or even merely face to face with God, but eyes closed, mouth to mouth, a union of the divine essence, the divine intellect, with the human essence, the human intellect, one which leaves the body dead in a heap on the ground, the life lovingly, longingly, passionately, consumingly sucked out of it from between its lips. This death, writes Maimonides, is in reality no death, but a salvation, a deliverance from death, a deathless death only achieved by Moses, the shepherd of God, his brother Aaron, the high priest, and his sister Miriam, the prophetess. The rest of the prophets and the pious did not reach this degree, but their knowledge/apprehension of God increased as the moment of death approached. Their intellects remained permanently enduring in that state of intense pleasure, not of the body, for all boundaries and obstacles between them and God had been removed. What Maimonides seems to be saying here, on Blumenthal's reading, is that while the kiss of death is beyond what most people can expect in their lifetime, or at the end of their lifetime, only privy to the select of the select of the select, even just to 3 biblical characters in total, the highest of human caliber, the lower penultimate state of death in the throes of intellectual ecstasy that one can achieve in the moments just before their death may indeed be possible for a wider range of people, the rest of the prophets and the pious, as Maimonides puts it, which puts it in the range, maybe not of ordinary people like me and you, but special people like me and you. Maimonides concludes this magnificent chapter with these words: "Endeavor with your heart to understand this chapter, try with all your might to increase the moments spent in which you are with or trying to be with God, and reduce the time spent when you are occupied with other things during which you are not striving to come close to God. These instructions," concludes Maimonides, "suffice for the object and purpose of this treatise." Now that we've laid out the chapter and walked slowly through it, next week, God willing, we will analyze the chapter, looking at its primary themes and language. We'll make an attempt to try and map out the chapter and conclude with an examination of its relationship to mysticism and Kabbalah. Let me know if you enjoyed this walkthrough. Last week's video, Maimonides' epistemology, was a little heavy, so I thought this week we might do it a little lighter. Let me know if you enjoyed it and how it was. I would love to hear back from you and to see if you're enjoying the pace, if we should move on to the next thing, or if this has been good. Please do feel free to leave a comment and say hi down in the comments section, both because I genuinely love to hear from you and because it does help YouTube's algorithm see that people are engaging and interacting with the video and therefore share it with more people. So please do pop down and say hi, send some love. Thank you for joining us to learn yet again. Thank you to all the people who have been reaching out with their appreciation. Thank you to all of the Patreons who sponsor this work that we are doing here, allowing us to explore these characters together and keep the lights running. If you can afford it and would like to, please do consider joining them. Thank you to Steven, a new friend of mine who reached out through the channel and offered me to come and film in his beautiful home. Thank you one and all for joining us. And until next week, keep seeking.